Welcome to the BioMedWire podcast, powered by IBN. This original audio production delivers market and sector insights, as well as exclusive interviews with innovative executives shaping the future in fast-moving industries, and may feature a client partner of IBN or one of the 60-plus investor-focused brands within IBN's dynamic brand portfolio. As a multifaceted financial news and publishing company, IBN leverages its extensive distribution network, utilizing multiple proprietary corporate communication tools to introduce both public and private companies to a vast and diverse audience of investors, consumers, influencers, journalists, and other targeted segments of the public. IBN may have received compensation to produce this audio content. Please be sure to read IBN's entire disclaimers for full disclosures. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the next revelatory episode of IBN's BioMedWire podcast.
Hi, I'm Kamal Fisher, and today I have Mr. Rob Etherington with me. We will be discussing Clene Inc. with the NASDAQ ticker CLNN. Rob Etherington is the CEO, President, and Director, and we are very excited to have this conversation today, Rob. As a start, welcome, but please jump straight into who Clene Inc. is and what the mission is to treat neurological diseases.
Thank you, Carmel. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. Clene is focused entirely on improving mitochondrial health and protecting neuron function. And this is a critical, even essential, even absolutely the most important thing we can do, actually, to treat neurodegenerative diseases. And by this, I mean neurodegenerative diseases such as ALS and MS and Parkinson's. And why this is particularly topical today is the World Health Organization is predicting that neurodegenerative diseases will become the second most prevalent cause of death within the next 2 decades, as it were. And so we're pioneering a very unique approach, the use of an oral suspension that patients take as a drug to pioneer catalytic nanotherapeutics, which again, I drink orally every morning to treat the deficits that I might have if I'm afflicted with one of these devastating neurodegenerative diseases.
Excellent. So just for our audience and their understanding, ALS is also typically known as motor neuron disease, and then MS, of course, is multiple sclerosis. Some of us are a lot more familiar with those terms, but your lead candidate, please share more about that candidate and how it could potentially treat Rett syndrome.
So you're right. Called within the United States for a number of decades, Lou Gehrig's disease, famously after the baseball player who contracted it in the 1930s. And it took 60 years for the first drug to be approved by the FDA. It was approved in 95. It's now generic, and it still remains today, 3 decades since 95. So 30 years ago, that drug is still standard of care. So there's obviously a tremendous need for new drugs in ALS. In the case of multiple sclerosis, there are a lot of drugs that can treat MS, but they all do effectively the same thing. They tamp down the body's immune response, so the body stops attacking itself. But what they do not do, and not a single one of them is indicated to do this in classical MS, is improve function. And by function, I mean the way patients move and walk and talk and eat and chew and breathe and even think in MS. Now, ALS patients, the opposite. Their brains are trapped inside bodies that stop working. You just mentioned Rett syndrome. So we've done some very early preliminary work that suggests that our drug works in another pediatric, particularly compromised in neurodegenerative disease called Rett. We have a long ways to go there, but the mechanism by which our drug works applies equally.
You touched on therapy, the nanotherapeutic approach, apart from other treatments that are in development also to treat ALS and MS. Was there anything that does more significantly set you apart from your competitors out there?
So nobody else has actually theorized that one could drink an oral nanotherapeutic as we have, and that it would do 2 specific things. It would improve the mitochondrial dysfunction that is endemic with these diseases and would improve or increase the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide that basically is compromised in neuron diseases of the nature of ALS. Now, let me say that a little bit more simply for our audience generally. So you and I, our brains are about 3 to 5% of our body weight, but consumes 25% of our energy every day. Night and day, we are powering our central nervous system to help us move and walk and talk and eat and chew and breathe. And in these diseases, that neuron is compromised. It loses the ability to talk to the muscles and orchestrate this grand choreography that enables us to do the things that you and I take for granted. Dress ourselves, feed ourselves, talk, chew, swallow. And so what we're doing is improving the mitochondrial dysfunction and the bioenergetic metabolite that our neurons rely upon to continue this function, and frankly, more so in ALS, especially survival, which is a big problem in ALS because patients, once diagnosed, typically pass away in 2 to 5 years. It's a remarkably horrible disease. Now, jumping to MS, patients don't pass away anymore because the DMTs, the disease-modifying therapies, of which there are many prescriptions written every year, $26 billion worth of them actually, they tamp down the immune system in MS very effectively. So my body stops attacking itself with multiple sclerotic lesions, therefore compromising function. But what our drug does is goes on top of that drug and does something entirely different. Enables the energetic capacity that those muscles require to function. And in ALS case, enables the main systems, my breathing primarily, to continue, so I have increased survival.
You speak of these functions that we do every day that is so second nature that we take for granted. And, I think it's incredible that you guys are working to give that back to these people who are plagued with these diseases. So I'm personally appreciative of that. Talk to us about the phase 2 Repair MS trial. What results came from that, and what does this mean for Clene's development pipeline and, of course, for patients?
Let me spend a minute on Repair, but then jump more importantly to Visionary. So Repair MS was a target engagement study, which basically showed that our drug taken by mouth orally, so I'm using a gesticulation here to show I'm drinking something. This is 60 mils, so that's between a quarter and a half a cup. If I was to drink this asset or my water glass blindfolded, I wouldn't know the difference. So it's very easy to administer. I take it in the morning before my meals. And then what happens is we saw the improvement of brain bioenergetic capacity to the equivalent of reversing decades of decline in healthy aging patients in Repair, let alone sick people, as the study was designed. So we saw this reversal of the NAD decline that we see with the assault of MS. Visionary, though, was a different study. So Visionary was designed to see if we could improve the way the neuron works and improve the capacity of the brain, namely its central white matter, or rather cerebral white matter, to actually help cognition and thinking occur better. So what we did with that study is took patients on drug for a year, and then we followed them for another 2 years, and we saw that we significantly demonstrated vision and a global neurological improvement in stable MS patients. So just to add a bit of context, these were patients that had no lesions. They had no MS attacks because their other drug was working as it should, but nonetheless, they had a vision compromise, or they had cognition compromise, or they had small motor compromise. Something so simple as figuring out how to button a shirt requires quite an organization of choreography with my fingers and my hands. And so what we did is put patients on our drug for a year and followed them for 2 further years, for a total of 3 years. And we saw that we had an improvement in vision, namely low contrast vision acuity. We saw that we had an improvement in cognition, the way they thought. And those improvements were very material, very impactful in the patients' lives.
Incredible. Moving on to a bit of a financial focus, how is Clene positioned to financially advance its clinical programs, particularly in light of the recent funding activities?
Well, we had a major raise last year for $40 million. That money is being spent as we speak. We announced that we had $28 million as of the start of the second quarter, April 1st. We've diminished our spend to enable that money to run longer, but we will eventually need to do another raise. I mean, that's just obvious if one looks at our cash position. But more importantly, we have right now a briefing book in front of the US FDA that we are asking to be considered for the possibility of accelerated approval. We don't yet know what the agency will say to Clene. We'll learn that later on this quarter, but that is a very topical question because in that briefing book, we submitted data of our clinical function, on our survival, and critically on the biomarkers that we saw in that program. Because just to give your listeners a little bit of context, biomarkers in ALS are called, there are many, but the one that generally we focus on, us and others, is neurofilament light. So as the disease, ALS, attacks the neuron, it leaves a debris field, as it were, in the bloodstream called neurofilament light. We can measure that evidence of a diminished / compromised / dying neuron. And if we can measure that and then we can reduce the neurofilament levels, it tends to be indicative of function and survival improving. And so we've taken all this data on survival and on neurofilament change, and we've submitted to the agency, coupled with how our drug is working mechanistically. And we're asking the agency if they would consider the possibility of an accelerated approval path for Clene's ALS asset. And back to your financial question, if the agency is amenable to this approach and lets us do a phase 3 study as accelerated approval would require, then that might enable earlier access to our drug. And it would also be an opportunity for us to go into the public markets and raise some more capital. Independent of that, we are also talking to some pharmaceutical companies who are under the hood looking at Clene. From a diligence perspective, presently as we speak, I spent some time with such an entity only an hour ago before this call, and that would enable also non-dilutive capital to come into Clene.
Let's talk now about the potential market size for CNM-Au8, and all of this obviously assuming successful completion of your clinical trials and the necessary regulatory approvals.
Well, first of all, let's focus on MS for the minute. MS is actually a very large market. There's more than 2 million MS patients worldwide. And those patients are prescribed $26 billion worth of prescriptions for multiple sclerosis drugs that tamp down the body's immune system. And yet none of those drugs, as I mentioned earlier, improve function. So if our asset has indication to improve function, the way people see or think or move, on top of the standard of care DMT, and our drug would be put in combination with these other DMTs, then a very large, it could be a very large size, even if you look at 26 billion as a prescription base and think about that massive number, and we only got a small portion of this, let's even call it 1/26th, then that is a significant number that could be treated with our asset to improve their function. Now, ALS is different. According to a 2023 report, the prevalence of ALS in this country is about 9 cases per 100,000 people. So if we put that into perspective and just think about, the number of people in America, and let's just round and call it 300 million, then, divided by 100,000 times 3,000, that's 30,000 patients that are out there. And we think this is, it's 27 to 30,000. We think this is a massive undercount, possibly, of how many ALS patients there actually are, because so many patients pass away so quickly.
Obviously they'll be scaling up production for CNM-Au8 and anything else you guys are involved in. How do you see that rolling out, and what challenges do you foresee, obviously, given regulatory approval, should that come to the fore?
So presently, we do all of our own manufacturing. It happens in a series of clean rooms in our Maryland facility. I'm talking to you from outside Park City, Utah, in a small town called Holiday. We have our clinical development and research hub here for clinic and in Maryland for manufacturing. And that manufacturing facility is plenty fine for all of our clinical studies and for our extensive expanded access protocols. So we have 4 of these. Those are compassionate use protocols where Clene has been authorized by the FDA to give our drug to patients under a expanded access or compassionate use protocol, even though we're not approved. So we can supply all of that capacity plus initial commercialization launch. But to your point, if we are approved to commercialize, we will need to vastly expand this capacity, and we have plans to do so in a greenfield facility that we presently own, but have not yet built the requisite clean rooms in, and won't be doing so until we have the necessary capital. But that'll again come at the point where we have a catalyst-driven raise because we're on the path to commercialization because of progress with the FDA. So in other words, there's plans in play to make sure that there's commercialization potential at the right time.
Wonderful. Can you elaborate on your strategy for potentially expanding CNM-Au8's applications beyond ALS and MS?
So we mentioned earlier Rett syndrome. We mentioned earlier briefly Parkinson's, and there are other diseases, including frontal temporal dementia and Huntington's, whereby our method of protecting the mito, enabling it the energy it requires to do its job, and enabling the bioenergetic metabolite to fuel neuron function all apply. So as you sense, we have a very unique responsibility even, because one asset could be utilized across a number of different diseases that have at its requisite need this ability to drive energy into a failing neuron.
Any key milestones that investors, our audience, should be looking out for in the next 12 to 18 months?
The most important one, as I mentioned earlier, is this quarter, is what's happening with the agency. The next one after that would be our filing of a new drug application and potentially the advisory committee, which is a public meeting that considers whether or not CNM-Au8 will be approved. Also, on top of that, we have 2 phase 3s that we will start at the right time. Capital needs are provided either because of non-dilutive funding from a pharmaceutical company or by capital raising. But this is the phase 3s for MS, so we can prepare a path to take that drug to market. And we always knew we needed a phase 3 for ALS for the rest of the world, namely Europe in particular. And so we would be commencing that study as well.
How does Clene's proprietary electrocrystallization process contribute to the efficacy of your nanotherapeutics?
Everything we do is an intersection of physics and material science into biology. So classical drug development would be a recipe of chemistry. That is not Clene. In fact, the opposite. We call the company Clene because we have clean surface nanotherapeutics, which is to say no synthetic chemistry. Everything we do is born in water. It's actually manufactured in an aqueous environment so that we can drink literally trillions of nanocrystals. It's a number so large it boggles the mind, but they're very small. They're 13 nanometers in size, which means that they can go inside the cell into the mitochondria and do their work. And for all of this proprietary elements, we have 150 granted patents. We have an equal number of trade secrets. And we have this great growing body of clinical evidence across ALS and MS we've just stated that supports the potential to really treat these neurodegenerative diseases.
So is Clene collaborating with academic institutions or other biotech companies to advance its research, and what does that look like?
So all of our work has been done with academic institutions, namely the rescue study was done in Australia with the 2 top ALS docs in that country. The visionary study was done in Australia and a bit of North America with the key MS players here, also based at academic institutions. And the Healy study critically was done at Harvard and 50 plus centers of excellence, all based at academic institutions across the country. So clinically, we've been very tied to academic institutions. Clene, though, owns entirely the asset. This CNM-Au8 was born at Clene, is organic to Clene, is 100% owned by Clene. So we don't have to share with academic institutions royalties or future commercialization revenues, though they are indeed critically our active partner in the clinical work. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're actually looking for a partner to help us on the MS program. And so we don't have a biotech partner at the minute, but we are looking for one.
Wonderful. Touching on plans for expanding Clene's pipeline beyond CNM-Au8, can you elaborate on those?
The mechanism by which we are able to manufacture a clean surfaced nanotherapeutic based upon a therapeutic elemental metal is applicable to many others. We have a pipeline of possibilities in the antiviral, antibacterial, and even more so in the neurodegenerative space. But we have effectively used, one pile of money to develop CNM-Au8 right now for to be wise stewards of the investment capital for our present neurodegenerative path. And once we understand clearly the commercialization opportunity, then we would be able to expand into other neurodegenerative and other disease areas with new therapeutic assets in the future.
Imagine clinical trials come with a lot of course, trial and error and a lot of insights that you can learn from those. How does that help you to develop your future research and development strategies? And can you elaborate on any of those insights that you've come face to face with in these clinical trials?
Well, both of the phase threes that we would organize in the case of multiple sclerosis to show if we could prevent, to help patients rather that are progressing with their multiple sclerosis independent of relapse. That is to say, they're having no further attacks, but their function is still declining. So that is the market need categorically in the MS space. And our goal would be to build a phase three that we can take to regulatory authorities worldwide to help us do that. And we would do such a phase three in partnership with key academic, key opinion leaders and academic institutions that focus on the multiple sclerosis disease worldwide. In the case of ALS, similar, our data is all around survival. And so we believe that the market need is to do an event-structured trial, especially relevant in Europe. The European regulatory authorities have really leaned into the need to have survival be a key endpoint for ALS, and Clene's asset is uniquely positioned to do that. And we plan to commence the phase three study for worldwide possible regulatory approval, hopefully by the top of the year.
So the regulatory landscape for nanomedicines is complex, to say the least. What are your strategies for navigating that complex landscape?
Well, exactly what we're doing now, which is the submission of our briefing book addressing a number of questions the agency earlier asked us, including we need to understand your mechanism better, including we need to understand your biomarker data and how this correlates to survival and function, and including safety, always a key piece. And thankfully, Clene has that strongly well organized. We have not a single serious adverse event related to drug from any of our clinical programs to date. That includes MS, ALS, and as I mentioned earlier, the small Parkinson's program we did. So taken together, this is, there's a strong risk-reward hypothesis or thesis here that we're addressing in our briefing book with the agency.
Let's talk about the intellectual property position of Clene and how this protects your unique drug development approach.
We have 150 patents granted across the world. This includes North America, but also Europe, parts of the Far East, in other words, Japan and Taiwan, China, even for granted patents in China, as well as the Middle East and as well as South America. So every key major market that pharmaceuticals have a key positioning, we have worked to prosecute our patents there, and we have not a single challenge to that patent prosecution, these last 11 years since we founded Clene in April of 2013. In addition, we have a fair number of trade secrets that protect the way we build this. And so we remain to date, even though we've been talking a lot about nanotherapeutics for some more than a decade, we remain the only player that we know of that is actually pursuing a nanotherapeutic approach to neurodegenerative disease.
Neurodegenerative disease treatments are an ever-evolving space. What do you foresee are the biggest challenges and opportunities in the near future?
Well, focusing on ALS first, there are a number of current drugs in development for which we and all ALS patients are grateful. This is a remarkably vexing and frankly quite devastating condition, and I envision a day where there will be multiple therapies that patients can be approved. That day is not yet tomorrow. Hopefully it's soon thereafter, because we really need to do all we can to move ALS from a uniformly fatal disease to a managed and chronic disease, which is exactly the progress we've made in multiple sclerosis.
So recent news speaks of a reverse stock split, 1-20. How does this strengthen Clene's position, and what benefits do you foresee bringing to shareholders with the increased visibility and liquidity?
As we filed on Friday, we are back in NASDAQ compliance. So that reverse stock split enabled us simply to get in compliance with NASDAQ, who is always concerned when any of its member companies drop below $1 for a sustained period of time. And Clene did do that. So we did the reverse split to pull us back into a stronger per share price, which therefore opens up the possibility of more institutional capital that might be compromised of investing in companies less than $1. So we've solved the box of NASDAQ lack of compliance quite effectively through the reverse split.
Excellent. Give us 3 key takeaways for our audience that you want them to walk away with our conversation. Thank you.
There's growing evidence to support CNM-Au8's therapeutic potential to treat neurodegenerative diseases, including ALS and MS. That's one. CNM-Au8 is the first gold nanocrystal suspension ever to basically remyelinate and protect neurological function, and we've been able to do this quite safely. And third, with our survival and biomarker data, we have a present ongoing conversation with the US FDA to see if they would let us consider the submission of a new drug application with a possible advisory committee to consider whether or not Clene can go on a commercial path now, or what would be the next step the agency wishes us to have.
Excellent, Mr. Rob Etherington. This was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate learning more about Clene Inc. with the NASDAQ ticker CLNN. I'm Carmel Fisher. You stay tuned for more.
The BioMedWire podcast is an original content production powered by IBN, a multifaceted financial news and publishing company that delivers next-generation corporate communication solutions. Utilizing proprietary corporate communication tools such as news aggregation and syndication, social communication, and brand awareness techniques, among others, IBN introduces both public and private companies to diverse audiences to enhance reach and recognition. IBN may receive compensation for services and solutions provided to its client partners. You should assume that the owners, officers, and directors of IBN or financial analysts mentioned in this production may hold a position in and may intend to trade the securities in their own accounts. This production is not an offer or recommendation to buy or sell any securities that may be mentioned in this production. The information in this broadcast is presented solely for informative purposes and is not intended to be or should it be construed as investment advice. As in all investments, investment in the featured companies carries inherent investment risk. Listeners should review the companies thoroughly with a registered investment advisor or registered stockbroker. This production by IBN is not purported to be a complete study of the featured company or other companies mentioned. Information used in statements of fact have been obtained from featured companies and other sources but not verified nor guaranteed by IBN as to completeness and accuracy. Such information is subject to change without notice. Please see IBN's full disclaimers and disclosures at www.ibn.fm/disclaimer. Music in this episode is by Infraction. For more, visit inaudio.org.